August 15th, 1942. The sun overhead beat down mercilessly on the metal deck of the USS West Point as it sailed eastward across the vast Pacific Ocean. Its precious cargo was not munitions or provisions, but human beings. 672 Japanese combatants, captured amidst the dense foliage of Guadalcanal, were confined within the ship's holds. Their own commanders had instilled in them the belief that surrender meant a fate far worse than death, painting vivid images of their captors lining them up for execution, barbarically slitting their throats, and discarding their remains like refuse. They were also warned that such ignominy would cast a shadow upon their families for generations to come. Consequently, when the heavy steel hatches were sealed shut and the rhythmic sound of marching boots echoed from above, the majority of the prisoners remained in silent apprehension, bracing for the expected brutality. The initial sound was not the sharp report of firearms, nor the clanging of restraints. It was something subtler, difficult to discern at first, a soft hissing, a gentle trickling, then the metallic chime of one utensil striking another. Sergeant Yamashita, pressed against the ship's interior wall, initially mistook it for escaping steam from the pipes, until the air became infused with the comforting aroma of cooked rice. American escorts then appeared at the hatchway, their footwear tapping rhythmically on the ladder. They carried no whips or bayonets. Instead, they bore ladles and platters filled with steaming nourishment, rice, meat, vegetables, and robust coffee poured into sturdy tin mugs. The prisoners regarded them with utter bewilderment. For men who had subsisted on nearly spoiled fish and dense, fist-sized portions of barley, the abundance of food on the trays appeared almost hallucinatory. Yamashita braced himself, convinced it was a ruse, that the food was laced with poison, and that the guards would revel in their collapse as they choked on the deck. Yet, as the first man cautiously took a bite, his hands trembling and his eyes darting around, nothing untoward occurred. He simply ate and ate and ate until tears streamed down his face. The oppressive silence, born of dread, was gradually replaced by the gentle scrape of spoons, the sounds of eating, and then an unforeseen development. Laughter, initially subdued, grew louder, a sound these men had not heard amidst months of arduous jungle combat. They had been led to believe they were mere animals caged for torment. Yet here they were, consuming rich meat that their digestive systems struggled to process, sipping coffee that stung their tongues, and observing guards who readily offered them second helpings without a trace of derision. By the time the vessel docked in San Francisco, the incarcerated soldiers had already begun to share hushed whispers of disbelief. "They are not starving us," they marveled. "They provide us with blankets. They treat us as fellow soldiers." The towering cranes of the harbor loomed over the bay, diligently unloading crates and swinging heavy barrels. And beyond the piers, the prisoners glimpsed a sight their leadership had never described: a vibrant metropolis teeming with automobiles, illuminated by countless lights, and adorned with colossal steel bridges that bisected the skyline. This was not a scene of barbarism or cruelty. It was a demonstration of power, certainly, but of a magnitude entirely alien to the fabricated narratives they had been indoctrinated with. From the ship to the trains, and from the trains to the barbed wire enclosures in Wisconsin, Colorado, and Texas, the revelations continued to unfold. For Lieutenant Shiru Kato, the critical moment arrived on his first night within the camp. He lay awake on his cot, convinced that the apparent benevolence was a mere facade, and that under the cover of darkness, the guards would inevitably infiltrate their quarters to commence their retribution. He strained his ears, listening for the telltale crunch of boots or the metallic click of a rifle bolt being drawn back. Instead, he detected a different sound, the faint crackle of a radio broadcast. Melodious music drifted from the guard station, not the strident rhythms of military marches or the thunderous beat of war drums, but the dulcet tones of a female vocalist, her voice weaving a gentle tapestry of song about love. It was the first night in many months that he allowed himself to close his eyes without the gnawing ache of hunger constricting his stomach. The adversary he had been conditioned to fear had lulled him into a peaceful slumber. Thus commenced a profound transformation, not through pronouncements or the signing of surrender documents, but through a series of simple, everyday revelations. The battlefield had broken them with the force of the rifle. The camps, however, would systematically dismantle their ingrained fear. The narrative of how men who had once sworn to confront Americans with unhesitating lethality began to offer them smiles, share their laughter, and even place their trust in them commences here during that protracted, sweltering summer of 1942, when the conflict they believed they comprehended was gradually eroded by an unexpected compassion, a force far more disarming than any projectile. The perimeter fence, constructed of barbed wire, stood 12 feet high and extended 3 layers deep, crowned with shimmering coils of steel that caught the sunlight. For the men confined within, it was intended to signify their utter subjugation. Yet, within mere weeks of their arrival, many of the prisoners no longer perceived it in that light. On their inaugural morning in Wisconsin, Shiru Kato awoke to the sharp, piercing sound of a whistle. His immediate thought was that it signaled an order for punitive drill, the kind of grueling exercise that imperial officers frequently employed to push exhausted conscripts through endless, demoralizing marches. However, this whistle signified breakfast. Lines of prisoners shuffled towards the mess hall. The invigorating scents of eggs and freshly baked bread assailed them with an impact akin to an artillery barrage. Plates clattered noisily, trays slid along service counters, butter melted luxuriously across slices of toast. Yamashita leaned towards Kato, his voice a low murmur. "They are providing us with more sustenance than we ever had in the jungle." Kato offered no reply. His thoughts were consumed by the sheer improbability of it all. Their own countrymen back home were subsisting on meager portions of thin rice gruel, yet here, deep within enemy territory, these captives were being fed as if they were laborers preparing for a bountiful harvest. Initially, some refused to partake, anticipating a poisonous deception. They observed their American custodians consuming the very same fare from the same kitchens, the identical bread, the same steaming coffee. Gradually, apprehension yielded to a burgeoning appetite. Within a few days, men who had fought valiantly at Tinnaru and the Matanika were consuming 3 meals a day, to the point where their waistbands became uncomfortably tight. The daily regimen within the camp was unyielding, but it was never characterized by cruelty. Labor commenced shortly after breakfast, involving the clearing of underbrush, the cultivation of gardens, and the mending of fences. Men accustomed to hacking their way through dense mangrove swamps and battling the oppressive, malaria-laden air now wielded axes, felling Wisconsin pines, the invigorating scent of pine sap filling their lungs. The guards observed their activities, but rarely issued harsh commands. The rhythm of the work was steady, humane, and for individuals who had anticipated the clank of shackles, there was an unexpected sense of liberation in engaging in labor that was unburdened by the constant specter of hunger or paralyzing terror. However, the most profound shock of all arrived on a Sunday. The distant ringing of a bell, carried on the wind, reached their ears. A contingent of prisoners gathered near the gate, their curiosity piqued. Across the expanse of fields, structures of white wood emerged, churches. Local townsfolk began to arrive, their Bibles tucked beneath their arms. Children, dressed in their finest attire, skipped merrily up the steps, their joyous laughter echoing clearly. Through interpreters, the guards explained the arrangements. Those who desired could attend religious services, listen to music, or remain within the confines of the camp. No penalty would be incurred for either choice. The very notion was beyond comprehension. Within the Imperial Army, religious observance was a mandatory duty. Here, it was presented as a matter of personal volition. Kato decided to attend, driven by a mixture of defiance and genuine curiosity. Inside, he observed rows of Americans bowing their heads, not in deference to an emperor, but to a deity whose name he had only encountered in hushed whispers. And then, the organ music commenced. The sound filled the air with a resonance unlike anything he had experienced since his childhood. It was not a martial anthem, but a piece of music that seemed to imbue the very walls with a palpable warmth. Some of the prisoners openly wept. They were uncertain of the precise reason for their tears. Perhaps it was because the music did not evoke sentiments of victory or defeat, but rather a profound sense of longing for home. As weeks gradually transitioned into months, the layers of accumulated fear began to dissipate through a series of small, significant moments. A guard casually distributing cigarettes without any hint of mockery. A local farmer expressing his gratitude to a prisoner for repairing his fence. Children peering at them from beyond the enclosure, their expressions one of innocent curiosity rather than animosity. In the evenings, the camps were illuminated by a different kind of revelation. Projectors were set up, screens were unfurled, and suddenly, men who had never witnessed a moving picture found themselves captivated by shadows that danced into vibrant life. Cowboy adventures, light-hearted comedies, American soldiers laughing heartily at the same jokes that resonated with the prisoners. For Yamashita, who had anticipated undergoing torture, the sight of guards and prisoners sharing mirth side by side felt like a deeply disorienting illusion. "Do you believe," he whispered to Cato, "that they are showing us these films as a form of mockery?" Cato responded with a slow shake of his head. "No," he stated, "they are showing us who they truly are." And who they were, it turned out, was a stark contrast to the monstrous image meticulously crafted in Japanese propaganda leaflets. These were individuals who toiled, dined, worshipped, and found joy. They were people who inexplicably treated their captives with a level of dignity that they themselves rarely afforded each other in the heat of battle. Correspondence from home began to arrive. The prisoners were granted permission to write to their families. Initially, most hesitated, feeling a profound sense of shame at admitting their survival. However, when the first replies materialized, conveying the immense relief of mothers whose sons were still alive, and wives sharing news of children born during the war, the dam of shame began to crack. The men realized that their families did not view them with contempt for having been captured. Rather, they were filled with profound gratitude. The guards also began to observe a noticeable shift. The prisoners started to carry themselves differently. The formerly stooped shoulders, indicative of defeat, gradually straightened. Laughter began to resurface in the barracks. Men who had once spoken in hushed tones of escape attempts now ceased to cast furtive glances at the fences. The barbed wire no longer symbolized a prison. It was perceived more as a boundary separating two distinct realms, and the existence within this boundary offered a greater sense of security than anything that might lie beyond. Evenings evolved into lively debates. The prisoners would gather around tables, animatedly discussing their observations. "If this is how they treat their enemies," one remarked, "how do you suppose they treat their friends?" Another mused, "It is no wonder they fight with such ferocity. They are clearly not suffering from starvation." It became abundantly clear to Cato that something truly profound was unfolding. The American captors had not subdued them through sheer brutality. Instead, they had systematically dismantled their deeply ingrained fear through acts of unadulterated generosity. The Garand rifle had certainly crushed their bodies on the battlefield, but it was the simple act of buttering toast, the shared laughter in the darkness, and acts of kindness extended without any expectation of reciprocation that ultimately dissolved their animosity. The irony was undeniably poignant. In the hands of America, they discovered a greater measure of humanity than they had often been afforded within their own military. And as the months elongated into years, this profound transformation deepened. By 1943, men who had once bellowed "Banzai" in a state of blind rage were now meticulously constructing furniture, engaging in spirited games of baseball, and acquiring English phrases from the very guards who had conquered them. They were supposed to harbor utter contempt for these individuals. Yet, with each passing day, the maintenance of that hatred became increasingly arduous. What had begun on the decks of the USS West Point had now seamlessly integrated into their daily existence. The Japanese prisoners had entered captivity fully expecting to meet their demise. Instead, they discovered a way of life that chipped away at their fear, one breakfast, one shared laugh, one projected film at a time. And for individuals like Cato, who would lie awake listening to the low hum of the radio emanating from the guardhouse, the realization was inescapable. The Americans no longer needed to instill terror in them. They had already achieved something far more enduring, their unwavering trust. The initial occasion when the camp gates swung open to permit a work detail was met with a profound silence throughout the barracks. No one could ascertain whether it was a deliberate ploy or the commencement of some cruel procession. Yet, as the trucks rumbled to a halt, painted in their distinctive olive-green hue with open cargo beds, the guards addressed them in calm tones. They were being dispatched to assist with the seasonal harvest. Cato sat rigidly in the rear of the truck, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Verdant rows of corn stretched as far as the eye could see, while fields of soybeans gently swayed in the breeze. The rural scenery of Wisconsin bore no resemblance to the war-ravaged jungles he had recently departed. The air was fragrant with the scent of rich earth, not the acrid smell of smoke. Birds chirped with an evident lack of fear. Upon arrival, local farmers, identifiable by their low-pulled hats, awaited them, their wives standing slightly behind with their harvest baskets. The guards stepped aside, signaling the prisoners to disembark, many uncertain of how to navigate this unfamiliar environment. For a considerable number, this marked the first instance since their capture that they had ventured beyond the confines of the camp's perimeter. The farmers did not shout commands, nor did they resort to physical reprimands. They calmly distributed tools, hoes, baskets, and gloves. One farmer, with a discernible smile, gestured as if instructing a newly hired hand. And then the work commenced. Rows of men clad in worn uniforms laboring shoulder to shoulder, the rich soil of America beneath their worn boots. The midday sun was intense, the physical labor demanding, but sustenance and water were readily available. At noon, the women of the farms brought forth sandwiches, ripe apples, and pitchers of lemonade that glistened with condensation. The guards partook in the repast. Then, after a brief pause, they gestured for the prisoners to join them. Cato hesitated. The act of accepting food directly from an American family felt almost unbearable, not out of any lingering fear of poisoning, but from a profound sense of shame. Yet, as a farmer's daughter, a child no older than 10, approached him, extending a crisp apple with her small hands, something within him shifted. He bowed awkwardly and accepted the offering. The young girl giggled at his formal gesture, then skipped back to her mother. By the time evening descended, the prisoners were physically exhausted, but utterly astonished. They had anticipated being met with suspicion and outright hostility. Instead, they found themselves treated with a level of consideration akin to that afforded to contract laborers. As the trucks conveyed them back to the camp, the men spoke in hushed, reverent tones. "They do not regard us as animals," one remarked. Another murmured, "If our countrymen were to witness this, they would simply refuse to believe it." Over the subsequent weeks, this new routine gradually became second nature. Trucks departed the camp at dawn and returned at dusk. In the fields, barns, and orchards, the previously distinct lines separating captor and captive began to blur. The farmers communicated slowly, patiently teaching them English vocabulary: corn, wheat, apple, good job. In return, the prisoners reciprocated by sharing Japanese words. Laughter began to supersede suspicion. Letters from their homelands started to convey a remarkably consistent message. Cities were being bombed, food supplies were critically low, and a pervasive sense of fear was constant. Families wrote of austere ration cards, enforced blackouts, and children crying from hunger pangs. Yet here, the prisoners were enjoying full meals, savoring coffee, and steadily gaining weight. The stark irony of their situation was palpable. Some experienced a profound sense of guilt, while others felt an overwhelming wave of relief. For the majority, the deep-seated shame associated with their capture began to recede, replaced by a profound gratitude simply for being alive. The guards observed a remarkable development. Their task of maintaining discipline became considerably easier rather than more challenging. The prisoners worked with genuine willingness, sometimes even volunteering for additional shifts. Escape attempts became exceedingly rare. Why would they risk venturing into a country where even the civilian population treated them with a degree of kindness that far surpassed that shown by their own officers in the past? There were, however, moments when the strangeness of it all cut particularly deep. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves transformed into hues of gold and the chill of the northern winds swept across the fields, Cato overheard a conversation between two American farmers. They spoke with casual familiarity, much like individuals exchanging gossip about their sons serving in the Pacific Theater. One mentioned his son was stationed on Saipan. Another recounted receiving letters from New Guinea. These words struck Cato with the sharp intensity of a bayonet thrust. The sons of these very kind farmers might well be the same individuals whom Cato's comrades had killed, or who, in turn, had caused the deaths of his own comrades. And yet, As the day drew to a close, these same men would clap him on the shoulder, casually handing him an extra sandwich for his journey back to camp. How could an enemy embody two such disparate personas simultaneously? Ruthless on the battlefield, yet so remarkably generous at the dinner table. Within the confines of the camp itself, transformations continued to multiply. Baseball diamonds were painstakingly carved out of open fields. Initially, the intricacies of the game made little sense to the prisoners. The peculiar equipment, the ball, the seemingly arbitrary nature of the bases. However, the guards patiently explained and demonstrated the rules. The prisoners, in turn, began to mimic the movements, and soon, a sense of competition began to flourish. By their second summer, teams comprised of Japanese prisoners were engaging in full-fledged games against their American counterparts, their laughter echoing across the perimeter fence as if the very concept of war were merely a distant, fading memory. Evenings became occasions for cultural exchange. A prisoner who had previously been a music instructor discovered a violin, its strings perhaps dusty, but its potential for sound undeniable. Another prisoner skillfully carved instruments reminiscent of a shamisen from discarded scrap wood. The guards contributed harmonicas, and soon, melodies began to mingle. Japanese folk tunes harmoniously blended with American country tunes. For the first time, these former prisoners of war experienced the profound sensation of not being feared, not being reviled, but of being an integral part of something shared. However, perhaps the most significant shift occurred with the advent of newspapers. American guards would occasionally leave copies of these publications in the mess hall. At first, the Japanese prisoners deliberately avoided them. Then, an insatiable curiosity began to take hold. They began to read about Allied advances, the steady capture of island after island, and vivid accounts of cities engulfed in flames back in their homeland. Yet, interspersed with this grim news were stories detailing ordinary life, the exploits of baseball stars, the outcomes of elections, accounts of petty crimes in small towns, a world that appeared not entirely consumed by hatred, but rather driven by the routines of everyday existence. Cato found himself captivated by photographs of smiling families in Chicago, advertisements for newly manufactured refrigerators, and images of school children. It was utterly impossible to reconcile these depictions with the vision meticulously painted in imperial propaganda, which portrayed Americans as uncivilized savages devoid of culture or honor. Here, within the printed pages, was irrefutable evidence of something entirely different. A society that was vibrant, prosperous, and possessed of a peculiar, captivating freedom. The prisoners began to engage in open discussions, not about escape strategies, but about the potential nature of life following the cessation of hostilities. Could they possibly return home and recount to their families the extraordinary experiences they had encountered? Would anyone lend credence to their improbable tales? Would they even be permitted to voice their observations? One evening, as the first flakes of snow began to descend, Cato found himself seated near the barrack stove, engaged in conversation with Yamashita. "Do you still harbor fear of them?" Cato inquired. Yamashita responded with a slow shake of his head. "On the battlefield? Yes. But here, within these confines? Number. How can I possibly feel fear towards a man who extends a hand to offer me bread when I am hungry?" A comfortable silence settled between them. Both men understood the unspoken truth. The American captors had effectively vanquished their ingrained fear, not through the application of firearms, but through the power of an unpretentious kindness that demanded absolutely nothing in return. By 1944, the internment camps no longer felt like literal cages. They were undoubtedly peculiar, filled with an undeniable longing for home, but they were certainly not places of abject terror. Many prisoners began to experience not dread of their captivity, but apprehension regarding the inevitable day of its conclusion, the day they would be compelled to return to a homeland where provisions were scarce. Families had been fractured, and the future remained shrouded in profound uncertainty. For Cato, this dawning realization carried a weight that was simultaneously burdensome and liberating. The enemy had, in fact, become human. And once an adversary is perceived as human, the corrosive grip of fear inevitably dissolves. Respect supplants hatred, and genuine curiosity replaces the consuming anger. And during those quiet, snow-muffled nights in Wisconsin, as a thick blanket of snow concealed the barbed wire fences, men who had once been resolutely prepared to embrace death rather than surrender now found themselves fervently wishing for the war to persist just long enough for them to remain in the place where they had unexpectedly discovered a profound sense of peace. The winter of 1944 bore down with relentless intensity upon the perimeter fences. Snow fell in thick, muffling layers, effectively silencing the world beyond the wire. However, within the warm confines of the barracks, the stove glowed with a vibrant red hue, and the air was thick with the comforting steam rising from numerous cooking pots. For the men who had initially anticipated a life of stark deprivation and starvation, their period of captivity had evolved into a perplexing paradox. They were consuming more food, gaining more weight, and even experiencing more moments of genuine laughter than at any point since their departure from home. For Cato, this particular winter marked a definitive turning point. He awoke one morning to the distinct sound of boots crunching on the icy ground, signaling the arrival of the guards with the day's provisions. The crates of food, when opened, revealed an abundance of flour, sugar, tins of preserved fruit, and even whole coffee beans. He gazed at the sheer quantity of sustenance with a pang of disbelief. He vividly recalled his mother's final letter, penned before his capture in a trembling hand. She had described interminable queues stretching for hours outside the rice shops, with rations barely sufficient to sustain the family's survival. And here, in the very heartland of the enemy nation, provisions were not measured in meager ounces, but in conspicuous excess. At dinner that evening, Yamashita leaned across the table, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Do you realize," he inquired, "I have gained 20 pounds since arriving here? My trousers no longer fit properly." The other men chuckled, clapping him heartily on the back, but the underlying truth of their situation weighed heavily upon them. They were in essence thriving in captivity while their own homeland was experiencing severe hardship and widespread hunger. Then the newspapers began to appear. The guards now intentionally left them behind, fully aware of the prisoners' eagerness to devour every single word. Headlines screamed of relentless American advances: Leyte Gulf, the Philippines, B-29 bombing raids over Tokyo. The war map displayed prominently in the mess hall, once adorned with bold swaths of aggressive Japanese red, progressively diminished week by week, as black pins meticulously marked the relentless progression of Allied forces. Cato studied those maps with an almost obsessive intensity. Each island lost represented another tangible step closer to home, another stark reminder that the once invincible empire he had sworn to defend with his life was, in fact, irrevocably crumbling. He recalled the impassioned speeches delivered by his officers, the unwavering promises of imminent victory, and the confident assurances that Japan's indomitable spirit would ultimately triumph over America's superior machinery. However, here, surrounded by an overwhelming abundance of America's technological prowess, their trucks, their tractors, their radios, their seemingly endless supply depots, the fallacy of those pronouncements was undeniable. Spirit alone, he now understood, could not fill empty bellies. It could not compensate for the absence of functioning factories, and it certainly could not shoot down squadrons of formidable flying fortresses. The men engaged in lengthy debates that stretched late into the night. Some clung stubbornly to their former loyalties. "Japan cannot be defeated," one insisted vehemently. "We will rise again." Others, quieter but demonstrably more numerous, simply shook their heads in resignation. "Open your eyes," they urged. "We have already been beaten." Yet, it was not despair that ultimately permeated the atmosphere. Instead, it was an overriding sense of curiosity. If America could provide such abundant sustenance for its prisoners, what must daily life be like for its own citizens? How could such a nation, with its seemingly limitless resources, possibly be vanquished? As spring arrived, the work details recommenced. The snow had melted, the rivers swelled with renewed vigor, and the familiar trucks once again rolled towards the farms and orchards. This time, however, the prisoners began to perceive something they had previously overlooked: the sheer ease and comfort with which the Americans lived their lives. A farmer's barn was equipped with tools that were far more sophisticated than anything available in their own military depots. Tractors effortlessly plowed vast fields in mere hours, tasks that would have required days of strenuous human labor. Children zipped past on bicycles with gleaming chrome handlebars. Women wore dresses fashioned from fabrics in vibrant, cheerful colors. Radios played music within the kitchens, as if the ongoing war were merely a distant, inconvenient distraction. One afternoon, while diligently stacking hay bales, Cato overheard a farmer's wife humming a cheerful tune emanating from a nearby radio. The melody was lively, playfully energetic, bearing absolutely no resemblance to the stern, martial anthems that had been drilled into him since his youth. His foot began to tap out a rhythm, a beat he hadn't consciously registered. She noticed, her laughter rising as she matched his tempo with an even more robust hum. In that fleeting instant, the adversary faded, replaced by a woman tending to her home, a reflection of his own mother in a world devoid of gnawing hunger. Back within the confines of the camp, the cross-cultural interactions blossomed. The overseers fostered dramatic performances, musical recitals, and even intellectual discussions. The individuals held captive by the Japanese presented theatrical productions inspired by kabuki traditions. The American attendees applauded heartily. Their curiosity piqued as they inquired about the performances and even sampled the costumes. In reciprocity, the prisoners gathered to observe baseball matches played under the illumination of floodlights, their cheers and boos conveying a genuine investment as if the score itself held immense consequence. What resonated most deeply with Cato was the palpable sense of liberty. Here, individuals could voice their thoughts without apprehension of censorship. The guards spoke freely about political matters, shared jests about the president, voiced criticism of military leaders, and faced no repercussions. For prisoners accustomed to a homeland where dissent led to incarceration, this openness was both disorienting and exhilarating. By the summer of 1945, the environment within the enclosures had undergone a profound transformation. The captives were no longer governed by the dread of punishment or the indignity of capture. They had been gradually remolded into individuals who no longer recoiled at the notion of their captors. Some even sought out opportunities for conversation with the guards, inquiring about American families and about states previously unknown to them, such as Kansas, Oregon, and Alabama. And then the atomic bomb detonated. The news swept through the camp like a sudden clap of thunder. Hiroshima was annihilated in a single moment. Tens of thousands perished. Even the most recalcitrant prisoners fell into a somber silence. For several days, the barracks were steeped in an atmosphere of profound sorrow and disbelief. Whispers circulated about relatives residing in the city and the implications of such a devastating weapon. Some men openly wept. Yet, when the second bomb struck Nagasaki and Japan announced its capitulation, the collective response was far more intricate. There was grief, certainly, but also an immense sense of liberation. The ceaseless pronouncements, the unattainable promises, the steadfast refusal of defeat in favor of death, all of it had crumbled within the span of a single week. The empire had dissolved. And with that dissolution, the apprehension of America vanished entirely. What remained to be feared? The victors had provided sustenance, clothing, and shelter. They had demonstrated compassion where none was anticipated. Now, they possessed a weapon capable of obliterating a city in an instant. Despite this, they still offered the prisoners cigarettes and coffee alongside their morning meals. Cato remained on his cot, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as the announcement permeated the camp. They would soon be returning to their homeland. For the first time in years, he experienced no apprehension regarding the Americans surrounding him. Instead, he felt a sense of dread at the prospect of departing. He recalled the farmer's daughter with the apple. He remembered the baseball games, the shared melodies beneath the starlit sky, the mirth echoing from the mess hall. He thought of the plentiful meals, the warm attire, and the astonishing realization that his captors had treated him with greater consideration than his own officers had once afforded him. That evening, Yamashita articulated what was likely on the minds of many. "I no longer fear them," he stated. "I fear going home." This sentiment was not an act of disloyalty. It was an unvarnished truth. The Americans had indeed subdued the prisoners, not through brutality, but through an overwhelming exhibition of power, coupled with an unexpected display of humanity. It was a weapon more formidable than any bomb, kindness offered in the face of animosity. As August transitioned into September, and preparations commenced for the transport vessels that would ferry them back across the Pacific, the prisoners lay awake in their bunks, contemplating how they might ever convey to their families the experience of residing in the enemy's territory and emerging not with their lives extinguished, but with their fear vanquished. The news of repatriation spread through the camp like a ripple through tall grass. Men paused mid-game, froze in the barracks with half-laced boots, set down their spoons and bowls of stew as the significance of the announcement settled in. The war was concluded. They were returning home. For weeks, the prisoners had existed in a state of suspension, caught between surrender and departure, observing the guards gradually relax their routines and the newspapers shift from battle reports to peace accords and rebuilding efforts. For many, the very concept of home had become almost mythical. They had clung to it like a sacred charm throughout their captivity, believing it would imbue their suffering with meaning. Yet now, with ships poised to carry them back across the vast Pacific, home felt not only distant, but also profoundly unsettling. Cato sat on his cot that night, his eyes tracing the contours of the duffel bag provided to each man. Within its confines lay essential provisions, garments, toiletries, and sustenance for the journey, a neatly organized American offering. He reflected on the last occasion he had carried a bag while in uniform, setting off for conflict with a heart brimming with resolute purpose. That youthful self was gone. In his stead sat a man whose existence had been irrevocably altered within the confines of this barbed wire. Around him, hushed conversations buzzed. Some spoke with palpable excitement, eager to reunite with their wives and children. Others appeared somber, apprehensive about what awaited them in cities rumored to be reduced to mere rubble. A few confessed what many dared not voice aloud. They harbored no desire to depart. The final weeks within the camp took on a surreal quality. Guards clasped hands with their charges, posed for commemorative photographs, and exchanged small tokens of appreciation. An American sergeant pressed a pack of cigarettes into Yamashita's hand, remarking, "For the voyage, you'll find these useful." Another presented his baseball glove to a prisoner who had developed a profound affection for the sport. What had commenced as a structured relationship between captor and captive evolved into something far more peculiar, a dynamic that neither side fully grasped how to define. Departure day arrived in early October. The camp gates swung open for the final time. Trucks formed orderly lines, and guards called out names from meticulously prepared rosters. Men ascended the vehicles, bags slung over their shoulders, casting lingering glances back at the barracks that had once seemed like cells, but now evoked a strange sense of familiarity. Cato's truck began to move, jolting him forward. He gripped the wooden railing, observing the camp recede into the distance. The baseball diamond, the watchtowers, the mess hall chimney still emitting faint wisps of smoke. Memories flashed before his eyes like a slideshow. The farmer's daughter and her apple, the soulful melody of a harmonica in the evening, snowflakes drifting down upon the barbed wire. Despite its inherent strangeness and its many contradictions, this place had, paradoxically, offered him the most secure years of his adult life. At the port, the sight of the waiting ship stirred a lump in his throat. Gray hulls, gangways extending like bridges, sailors issuing commands. The sea air carried a sharp, boundless scent. Prisoners disembarked onto the ramps in solemn procession, the weight of their departure pressing down more heavily than their duffel bags. The voyage proved arduous, far more so than their initial arrival years earlier. This time, they were not eager soldiers embarking on a campaign of conquest, but defeated men returning to scenes of devastation. Nevertheless, the ships were provisioned with typical American efficiency, offering hot meals, medical attention, and berths with clean linens. Some men attempted to find humor in the irony of the situation. Even in their defeat, the enemy ensured their comfort. Others sat in silent contemplation, gazing out at the horizon, as if hoping the vast expanse of the sea might offer answers to questions their hearts could not formulate. When Japan finally materialized on the horizon, it was a land vastly altered from the home they remembered. Cities lay in ruins, docks bore the scars of destruction. Smoke continued to rise from the charred remains of industrial complexes. The air carried not the scent of harvest, but of dust and pervasive hunger. Families stood on the docks, their faces thinner, their eyes bearing the hollowed look of prolonged rationing. Cato stepped ashore, his heart pounding like a drum. His mother was waiting, clutching a scarf around her shoulders. He embraced her, feeling the fragility of her bones beneath the fabric, so delicate he feared she might shatter. She wept, not solely from joy, but from the profound relief that he had survived when so many others had not. Yet, as the days unfolded, the stark reality began to assert itself. Food was scarce, employment was elusive. The emperor's voice had announced their surrender, but the profound humiliation of defeat permeated every conversation. Neighbors exchanged hushed whispers of shame. Men who had returned from other fronts remained silent about their experiences in the camps, apprehensive of being perceived as weak. Cato once attempted to explain to his mother the nature of life in America, the abundance of food, the pervasive kindness, the shared laughter, but she regarded him as if he were speaking a forbidden tongue. "Do not speak such things," she implored in a whisper. "Others will not comprehend." He quickly learned that silence offered a greater measure of safety, yet within the sanctuary of his mind, the memories persisted. He dreamt of baseball fields, of coffee steaming in tin mugs, of music drifting from camp windows. He recalled how his fear of Americans had gradually dissolved, how he had come to perceive them not as monstrous figures, but as ordinary individuals. In the ensuing years, Cato established a life in a Japan grappling with Reconstruction. He worked diligently, married, and raised children. However, whenever he heard the echoes of laughter from a schoolyard, or caught the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread emanating from a shop, he found himself transported back to those improbable years when the enemy had become his instructor, his neighbor, and, in a peculiar way, his friend. Yamashita sent him a letter years later. It was brief, measured, composed in formal language. At the conclusion, however, a single line pierced through the formality. "I still dream of the camp," it read. "I still dream of the nights we felt no fear." Cato carefully folded the letter, placed it in a drawer, and never divulged its contents to anyone. Some truths were simply too burdensome for a nation steeped in defeat to contemplate. But deep within, he knew. Fear had been stripped from him during those years spent behind barbed wire. And although he carried his silence in his homeland, the memory endured that the war had imparted a lesson no officer had ever conveyed. The enemy's most potent weapon was not its arsenal of weaponry, but its capacity to regard its captives as human beings. For the Japanese prisoners of war who returned, their time in America became a clandestine chapter of their lives, one they guarded discreetly, a narrative that could not be openly shared in a society founded on sacrifice and shame. However, within the private realm of remembrance, many acknowledged a shared truth. They had lost everything in the war save for their lives. And in relinquishing their fear of America, they had, in the most unexpected manner, rediscovered a path toward their own humanity.